In a basement you'd walk past without a second look, somewhere outside a small city in Vermont, there's a stack of plastic bins doing something most people would call disgusting. Worms, eating garbage, coffee grounds, banana peels, shredded junk mail, crushed eggshells, the stuff that goes in your trash can without a second thought. And every single month, that stack of bins is worth more to its owner than most people's second job, $3,900. That's not a typo, and it's not the ceiling either. That's a documented, repeatable number from a single basement operation. No employees, no storefront, no delivery truck, no website with a marketing budget behind it. Just bins, worms, and 2 years of patience. Think about what this actually requires before we go further, because the list is almost insultingly short. A corner, not a yard, not a plot, not an acre. A corner of a basement, a garage, or a shed. Roughly the footprint of a compact car parked sideways. A few plastic totes you could buy on a single trip to a hardware store. A starter colony of worms you could order online and have delivered to your door in a padded box. And the willingness to feed something small and unglamorous consistently for longer than most people are willing to wait for anything these days. Stick with me, because over the next stretch, I'm going to walk through exactly how a stack of bins in a basement turns into a real 4-figure monthly check, what it actually costs to start, what the biology underneath it is actually doing, where the money really comes from broken down honestly instead of rounded up for effect, how the packaging and the pitch actually work when you're standing in front of a buyer, what goes wrong for the people who fail at this, what the legal and tax picture actually looks like once real money starts moving, how the seasons affect all of it, and the questions people ask most often once they've decided to actually try it. None of it requires land. None of it requires a truck. All of it starts in a basement, a garage, or a shed with a stack of bins most people would step right over without a second glance. Before the Second World War, keeping a worm bed wasn't a business, and it wasn't a hobby either. It was just something a household did, in roughly the same category as keeping a compost heap, a rain barrel, or a root cellar. Kitchen scraps went into a bin instead of the trash. Worms turned that mess into a dark, crumbly material within a matter of weeks, and that material went straight back into the vegetable garden or the flower beds without anyone treating it as anything special. It wasn't marketed. It didn't have a brand name. It was just how a household closed the loop between what it threw away and what it grew. Then the 1950s arrived, and with it, the bag of synthetic fertilizer. Cheap, shelf-stable, available at every hardware store and feed store in the country. No mixing, no smell, no worms to manage. Why keep a bin crawling with red wigglers in your basement when a 20-pound bag of powder promised faster, more dramatic, more predictable results for a few dollars? On paper, the math looked obvious. Worm keeping stopped being a household skill passed down between generations and started being something your grandparents did, if they did it at all, and within about a generation, it had mostly disappeared from ordinary backyards. Here's the twist that took decades to surface. Synthetic fertilizer feeds the plant directly, but it does almost nothing for the soil underneath the plant. Decades into widespread synthetic fertilizer use, researchers and gardeners alike started noticing a slow, troubling pattern. The living system inside healthy soil, the bacteria colonies, the fungal networks, the biology that actually keeps a root zone resilient over the long run, was quietly thinning out, field by field, garden bed by garden bed. The shortcut hadn't just replaced the worm bin, it had replaced an entire living system with a temporary chemical patch, and eventually the soil itself started showing the difference in crops that needed more and more input every season just to hold steady. That gap is exactly what this business walks through, and it's worth understanding who's standing on the other side of it, because these are not abstract buyers. Organic certified farms are, in many cases, legally required to source inputs that meet strict certification standards, and synthetic fertilizer disqualifies them instantly. Full stop, no exceptions. Boutique nurseries increasingly serve customers who ask directly at the register whether a product is chemical-free, and a nursery that can't answer yes loses that sale on the spot, often to a competitor down the street who can. Vineyards and orchards, which plan to keep the same acreage in production for decades rather than seasons, have strong long-term incentive to protect soil biology rather than mine it season after season for short-term yield. And the fastest growing buyer group of all is high-end indoor cultivation, growers running climate-controlled rooms who treat their root zone with the precision of a laboratory and will pay a genuine premium for the richest, most biologically active input available, because to them, the cost difference between an ordinary amendment and a premium one is nothing compared to what a weak or inconsistent crop would cost. That's the market this business sits inside. Not a niche of hobbyists buying novelty compost, but a real and growing base of buyers who specifically do not want the synthetic option and are willing to pay for the alternative that 100 years ago nobody would have thought to charge extra for in the first place. Let's actually go inside the operation. This number comes from because the physical setup is almost comically simple, and that simplicity is part of the point. 5 plastic totes, the kind sold at any hardware store for around $12 each. Ventilation holes drilled along the sides so the colony can breathe without drying out the whole bin. A raised false bottom inside each bin, usually built from a second, shallower tray with holes drilled through it to let excess moisture drain away from the worms instead of pooling around them. A spigot fitted to the base of the lowest bin to collect the liquid runoff before it sits and turns anaerobic. Total build cost for the entire rig, bins, drainage material, and the starter worms themselves lands somewhere in the low hundreds of dollars. That is the entire capital investment standing between an empty basement corner and a functioning small business. No loan, no storefront lease. No specialized equipment beyond what you could carry home in the trunk of a car in a single afternoon. Once the basic bins prove themselves, the natural next step for anyone serious about scaling is a flow-through tray system. Instead of 5 separate closed bins, a flow-through setup is a single tall tower of stacked mesh trays, fed from the top, harvested from the bottom, so finished castings can be pulled out continuously without ever having to dig through active bedding to find them. These systems cost more up front, typically several $100s for a unit large enough to matter, but they save enormous amounts of labor once an operation is running multiple bins worth of material at once, because harvesting stops being a messy hand-sorting job and starts being closer to opening a drawer. Bedding matters more than most beginners expect. Shredded cardboard, torn into strips rather than left in large sheets, gives worms both food and structure to burrow through. Plain newspaper, avoiding glossy inserts and colored print, works the same way. Coconut coir, a byproduct of the coconut industry sold in compressed bricks, holds moisture evenly and resists compacting the way straight paper sometimes does, and a lot of more established operations blend coir into their bedding mix specifically for that reason. None of this bedding material costs much, and much of it, particularly the cardboard and newspaper, is free if you simply save what would otherwise go into a household recycling bin. Inside those bins live red wigglers, the species responsible for essentially all of North American vermicomposting for the better part of a century. It's worth being precise about why this specific worm and not the earthworm you dig up in a garden bed. Red wigglers live near the surface of decaying material rather than burrowing deep, which makes them suited to a shallow bin rather than open ground. They tolerate crowding far better than garden earthworms, which matters enormously in a contained system where population density climbs quickly. And critically, they eat aggressively and reproduce fast when conditions are right. A healthy starting colony of roughly 2,000 worms can double its population in something like 2 to 3 months under good feeding and moisture conditions. That detail matters more than almost any other number in this whole business because it means the core asset at the center of the operation is quietly growing itself without a single additional dollar spent for as long as it's properly fed and maintained. And what does that colony actually eat? Garbage, in the most literal sense. Coffee grounds and the paper filters they come in, vegetable and fruit peels, crushed eggshells, which help balance the acidity of the bin and give the worms grit they need to digest food properly. Shredded cardboard and plain newspaper used as bedding material, which the worms also slowly consume along with the food scraps. What they cannot handle is just as important to know as what they can. Meat, dairy, oily foods, and heavily processed items will rot before the worms can process them, attract pests, and can crash an entire bin if added in any real quantity. The raw material cost for feeding a colony this size runs close to nothing at all, because the overwhelming majority of it is material a household would otherwise be putting directly into a landfill-bound trash can. That is the first number worth sitting with in this entire business. In an operation built around selling a fertilizer product, the input cost is essentially zero. None of this is presented as effortless, though, because a business built on a living colony of worms is not a machine you can simply switch on. It takes real patience before it produces anything sellable. A brand new bin typically needs somewhere between 2 and 4 full months before there is enough finished, fully processed castings material to actually harvest and sell. Overfeed the bin during that window and it will go sour, the material turns anaerobic, an unpleasant smell develops, and the worms will actively try to migrate away from the food rather than process it. Let the bin get too wet, and you risk drowning a meaningful portion of the colony while producing a foul, sludge-like byproduct instead of the clean, crumbly castings buyers actually want. Let it get too dry, on the other hand, and the colony's reproduction slows to a crawl, or the worms die off outright trying to retreat toward the moisture that remains. None of this is difficult once you understand the rhythm of it, but it does mean the first 3 to 4 months of this business are pure setup, feeding, and observation, with zero income arriving during that entire stretch. Anyone presenting this as a business that pays starting in week 1 is quietly skipping the part that actually determines whether it works, where the $3,900 actually comes from. Let's walk through the math properly, because this is the part most treatments of this topic skip entirely in favor of the headline number alone. A single bin does not produce $3,900 a month. Nothing close to it. The number in this title comes from a mature, well-run operation. 5 to 6 totes working in parallel, a flow-through tray system added once the operation outgrows individual bins, and roughly 2 years of compounding worm population growth behind it. That is the real starting point for this number, and it deserves to be said plainly because the honest version of this business is a 2-year build, not a 2-week hack, and treating it otherwise sets up exactly the kind of disappointment that causes people to quit in month 3. Here's how the revenue actually breaks down once an operation reaches that mature stage. Finished castings sold in small labeled retail bags at a farmer's market or through local word of mouth run around $5 a pound, which is the highest per pound price the castings themselves ever fetch. But it comes with a time cost of retail selling attached to it. Standing behind a table, talking to customers, making change. Sold in bulk instead, to a landscaper, a nursery, or a serious home grower, buying by the cubic yard or in large sacks, the price per pound drops to somewhere between $1 and $3. But the volume moved per transaction goes up considerably, which is exactly the trade-off a maturing operation needs to move product faster than retail alone ever could. Live worms sold to people setting up their own bins for the first time. A market that has grown steadily as more households take up backyard composting on their own, fetch the highest per pound figure on the entire list, somewhere between $20 and $40 a pound because you are selling a living, actively reproducing product rather than a static material. Buyers paying that price aren't just buying worms, they're buying a working starter colony that will grow into their own future supply. And that's worth explaining directly when you're pricing it because it reframes the transaction from a bag of bait to a small living investment. And worm tea, the nutrient-rich liquid that drains naturally out of the base of a well-built bin, sells by the gallon for somewhere between $10 and $25, with almost no additional labor required to produce it, since it is a byproduct of simply maintaining the bin correctly rather than a separate production process. Some operations dilute and bottle it themselves for retail sale, others sell it in bulk containers directly to a landscaping account, and either approach works since the product essentially produces itself. Now stack those 3 revenue streams against a realistic monthly output from a mature setup. Once the flow-through tray system is in place and the colony has fully compounded, a setup of this size typically produces somewhere around 35 to 45 pounds of finished sellable castings each month. Split that output between retail bags sold locally and a standing bulk order with a nursery or landscaping account, and castings alone typically land somewhere between $1,500 and $2,000 in a given month. Layer live worm sales on top of that, harvested off the naturally overproducing colony without ever touching the working stock that produces the castings, and that channel adds another $800 to $1,200 in a typical month. Round out the picture with worm tea sold to a handful of regular local customers, plus the occasional larger order from a landscaping company clearing a big property, and the final several $100s of the total shows up almost as a rounding error layered on top of the other 2 channels. Add all 3 together in a solid month with every channel running at once, and the total lands right around $3,900. Not from one bin sitting quietly in a corner, from a coordinated system of 5 to 6 bins, fed correctly and consistently, that has had 2 full years to compound into something that actually looks like a small business rather than a novelty. It's worth pausing on how forgiving that math actually is compared to most small businesses. There's no rent eating into the margin. There's no inventory that spoils if it doesn't sell this week, since dried, bagged castings hold their value for months. There's no seasonal shutdown the way there is with many outdoor crops, since the bins themselves live indoors year-round regardless of the weather outside. The 3 revenue streams aren't stacked on top of each other by accident. They're stacked because the underlying colony is producing all 3 simultaneously whether or not you've lined up a buyer for each one yet, which means the ceiling on this business is set almost entirely by how many buyers you find, not by how much the worms are capable of producing who's actually buying, and how you find them. None of the numbers in the previous section mean anything without real standing buyers on the other end of them. And this is the part where most people attempting this business get the order backwards. They build the bins first, get the colony established, and only then start looking for somewhere to sell what comes out of it. Flip that order, and the entire business becomes noticeably easier to run. Start local and start narrow rather than broad. Independent nurseries and garden centers make the single best first customer relationship in this whole business because they already have a customer base actively asking for organic soil amendments, and because landing even one modest standing wholesale account converts your production from a hope that a farmer's market crowd shows up into something closer to a predictable recurring order. A short visit, a couple of sample bags, and a simple one-page price sheet is usually enough to open that conversation. Most small nurseries are already used to being pitched by distributors and wholesalers, and a local producer showing up with an actual physical product in hand tends to stand out immediately against a printed catalog from 3 states away. Farmers markets are the second channel worth building, and they're where the retail level margin lives, since you're selling directly to the end customer instead of through a wholesale middle step. The trade-off is that market selling consumes real time: a table, a sign, packaging that looks presentable, and a full weekend morning given over to it. It's worth treating this channel as the retail-facing half of the business rather than the entire business, because trying to build the whole operation around market days alone caps growth at whatever a single weekend crowd can absorb. The channel almost nobody talks about, and arguably the most overlooked one in this entire list, is the hobbyist worm market itself. As more households take up backyard composting on their own, there is steady, ongoing demand for starter colonies of live worms, and this happens to be the segment where the single highest per-pound price on the entire list lives. A simple local classifieds listing, refreshed occasionally, or an occasional post in a gardening community, tends to generate a slow but genuinely steady trickle of worm orders, with almost no ongoing marketing effort required to sustain it. And finally, there's the buyer type that quietly ties this whole business back into the demand described earlier: the indoor cultivation community. High-end indoor growers researching soil biology are frequently willing to pay the highest sustained price on the list for castings with documented consistent quality, because to them, the cost of the input is trivial set against the value of the crop it's protecting. A single durable relationship with even one serious indoor grower can, on its own, account for a meaningful share of the entire monthly total, which is exactly why cultivating that one relationship carefully, rather than treating it as just another customer, tends to separate a merely profitable operation from a genuinely thriving one. A local Facebook gardening group, a community bulletin board at a hardware store, a simple table at a plant swap, none of these cost anything beyond a little time, and all of them work because this is fundamentally a local, trust-based business rather than one that scales through advertising. The buyer wants to know their castings came from 20 minutes away, not from a warehouse 3 states over, and that proximity is itself part of the pitch, not an afterthought to it. How the product looks and how it's described matters more than most beginners expect, because castings are, on first glance, indistinguishable from ordinary dirt to someone who hasn't bought this kind of product before. A simple craft paper bag, a clear label with the product name, the source, and basic usage instructions, and consistent bag weight from batch to batch does more to justify a premium price than almost anything else you could spend money on. Buyers, especially nurseries considering a repeat wholesale order, are quietly judging whether this looks like a hobby project or a real product, and packaging is where that judgment gets made before a word is exchanged. The pitch itself works best when it's short and specific rather than general. Rather than describing castings as good for plants, the stronger version names what it actually does: slow-release nutrients that won't burn roots the way synthetic fertilizer can, living microbial content that most bagged commercial products lose during manufacturing, and a locally produced source a buyer can actually visit if they want to see the operation for themselves. That last point, the ability to physically show a buyer where their product comes from, is a genuine advantage over any large commercial competitor, and it's worth using directly rather than assuming a buyer will infer it on their own. Every honest version of this story has to include the failure points because they're where most people attempting this business actually lose momentum, and they're almost entirely avoidable once you know what to watch for. The single most common mistake is overfeeding. It's tempting, especially early on, to dump every scrap of kitchen waste you generate into the bin at once, assuming more food simply means faster results. In practice, an overloaded bin quickly turns anaerobic, develops a genuinely unpleasant smell, and the worms will actively attempt to escape the bin entirely rather than process material that's rotting faster than they can consume it. The fix is almost embarrassingly simple in hindsight. Feed noticeably less than instinct suggests, and only add the next round of scraps once the previous feeding has largely disappeared. The second common mistake is poor moisture control. A bin that's too wet risks drowning a meaningful portion of the colony and produces a foul, sludge-like byproduct instead of the clean, crumbly finished castings buyers actually expect. A bin that's too dry, on the other hand, stresses the colony and slows reproduction to a near standstill, since red wigglers need consistent moisture to breathe through their skin at all. The right moisture level feels roughly like a well-wrung-out sponge, damp throughout but never dripping, and once you've felt that texture correctly a single time, it becomes easy to recognize by feel every time afterward. The third mistake, and one of the more counterintuitive ones, is scaling too quickly. Once the first bin starts producing consistently, it's tempting to build out 5 or 10 additional bins all at once, assuming more capacity simply means more output. But the underlying worm population takes real time to grow into new capacity, and a rushed expansion typically just results in 10 underfed, understocked bins producing worse results than 5 properly maintained ones would have. The compounding growth this entire business model depends on only works if the population is actually allowed to compound before more physical capacity is added for it to fill. And the fourth mistake, less obvious than the first 3 but arguably just as damaging, is underpricing. New sellers, unsure of how their product will be received, often price finished castings far below the going market rate out of fear that nobody will pay full price for something that looks, on the surface, like dirt in a bag. In practice, the buyers who matter most in this business, established nurseries and serious indoor growers, are not price shopping against big box synthetic fertilizer at all. They are specifically paying for quality, consistency, and traceability, and pricing well below the market rate mostly just signals to those buyers that the product isn't being taken seriously by its own producer. A fifth, quieter mistake worth naming is inconsistent quality between batches. A buyer who receives a rich, evenly textured bag one month and a wetter, uneven bag the next month loses confidence fast, even if both batches are technically fine. Screening finished castings through a simple mesh sifter before bagging and keeping feeding and moisture logs so each bin's results stay predictable solves this almost entirely, and it's a habit worth building from the very first harvest, rather than adding later once a buyer has already noticed a problem. One of the quieter advantages of this particular business is how little regulatory friction actually stands in the way of starting it. In most jurisdictions, there is no agricultural permit required simply to keep a colony of composting worms in a residential basement, garage, or shed. There is no zoning board that concerns itself with a stack of covered plastic bins full of compost. And there is no special license required to sell finished compost products locally, whether through a farmer's market, a nursery account, or direct local sales. Depending on the specific city or county, a basic home business registration may eventually become worthwhile once sales become regular and recurring. And clean, accurate labeling matters if you're packaging and selling retail bags. But compared to nearly any other small-scale agricultural venture, this regulatory floor sits about as low as it's possible to go. That low barrier is, in its own way, tied directly into why this business rewards patience over speed rather than the reverse. There is no permit process gatekeeping who's allowed to enter this market. No licensing exam standing between a beginner and their first sale, which means the only genuine barrier separating a spare basement corner from a functioning income stream is the roughly 2 years of consistent feeding and compounding it takes to get there. Nobody is stopped by paperwork in this business. People are stopped by giving up around month 4, right when the setup phase ends, and the first real harvest is still weeks away. Once real money starts moving through the operation, though, it's worth treating it like the small business it's becoming rather than an environmental side project. A simple spreadsheet tracking what came in from each channel, castings, worms, and worm tea, kept separately, makes it far easier to see which part of the business is actually growing and which part is stagnant. Setting aside a portion of every sale for taxes from the very first dollar, rather than trying to reconstruct a year's worth of transactions the following spring, avoids the single most common bookkeeping regret among people running small local businesses like this one. None of this requires an accountant on day one. It requires a habit, kept consistently, of writing down what sold, to whom, and for how much. The path from a single tote to a genuine $3,900 a month has a rough, repeatable shape to it, and it's worth laying that shape out honestly, because it does not move in a straight line. Months 1 through 4 are pure setup. Bins are built. The starter colony is introduced. A feeding rhythm is established through trial and error, and there is no product to sell yet at any point during this stretch. This is, without question, the stage where most people who eventually abandon this business actually quit, precisely because there's no visible progress to point to yet, even though the underlying colony is quietly establishing itself the whole time. Months 5 through 8 typically bring the first real harvests, usually modest in size, alongside the first tentative customer relationships, often built at something close to a time loss relative to the money actually earned during this window. This is the stage where the operation starts to feel real for the first time, even though the numbers involved are still small. By month 12, with the colony having doubled once or perhaps twice over the preceding year, there is usually a standing local buyer or two in place, and the operation begins producing a modest but genuinely real supplemental income for the first time, often somewhere in the low hundreds of dollars per month rather than anything close to the headline figure. It's typically somewhere in the 18 to 24 month range that an operation crosses over from side income into something that actually resembles the number in this title. That's the point at which the worm population has fully compounded from its original starting size, a second or third bin, or a flow-through tray system has been added to accommodate that growth, and multiple sales channels, retail, wholesale, worm sales, and worm tea, are all running simultaneously instead of relying on just one at a time. It is the combination of a fully compounded colony and multiple simultaneous revenue channels, not any single dramatic breakthrough, that actually produces the number this whole video is built around. Beyond that 24-month mark, growth tends to come from adding a second flow-through tower rather than more individual totes, since the labor savings of the tray system scale far better than another shelf full of separate bins would. Some operations at this stage also start selling small starter kits, a compact bin, bedding, and a small starter colony packaged together for beginners, which converts a portion of the live worm sales into a slightly higher margin, more polished product without requiring any change to the underlying production process at all. A few questions come up often enough from people considering this that they're worth answering directly rather than leaving implied. Does it smell? A properly maintained bin, fed correctly and never overloaded, has a mild, earthy smell close to fresh soil after rain, not the smell most people associate with garbage or rot. The smell problem people worry about is almost always a sign of overfeeding or excess moisture, not an inherent feature of keeping worms indoors. Can this be done in an apartment? A small-scale version, a single bin or two, can genuinely work in an apartment with reasonable ventilation, though the ceiling on income at that scale stays modest, since the physical space caps how many bins can realistically be maintained. What happens if you go on vacation? Red wigglers are notably tolerant of being left alone for a week or two at a time, provided they were fed adequately before you left, which is one of the reasons this business fits more easily around a full-time job or family schedule than many other small ventures would. How much time does this actually take each week? Once established, a mature multi-bin operation typically takes somewhere between 3 and 5 hours a week for feeding, moisture checks, and harvesting. With additional time added on farmers market days or during a harvest push for a large wholesale order, a slower month for castings. Sales tends to line up naturally with a stronger month for worm sales because the same growing season that makes buyers cautious about spending on soil amendments is often precisely the season when new hobbyists are setting up their very first bin. That's the entire story behind a title that, on its face, sounds almost absurd. $3,900 a month from worms in a basement. It sounds implausible right up until you see the underlying math laid out honestly, and at that point it stops sounding like a scheme and starts sounding like ordinary patience paired with reasonably careful bookkeeping. If there's a spare corner of a basement, a garage, or a shed sitting unused right now, that corner is already the entire physical footprint this business actually needs. If you've ever kept a compost bin yourself, or if someone in your family used to keep one without ever thinking of it as anything special, say so in the comments. Subscribe if you'd like to see which one comes next.